So what we're going through today is selection and repetition. And if you've had other coding classes, how you do it in PHP is very similar to how you do it in C#, how you do it in JavaScript and other languages. So we're going to talk about selection first, and then we'll get into repetition. So for selection structures, we have if else, nested if else, and switch statements. For the if statement, it's basically a single-sided if, so we're really only concerned with doing actions if the condition tests true. And this is how you set it up. You've got if, in parentheses, the condition that you're testing. And then if you're only going to execute one thing, you do not need curly braces. But if you're going to do more than one thing, you do have to put it in the curly braces. So in between curly braces would be all of your action statements that you want it to execute if it's true. So here we have a little example. We have an overtime variable that we're setting to 0. Hours worked is set to 45. And then the if is checking hours worked to see if they've worked more than 40 hours. Because if they have, then we have to figure out how many overtime hours they've worked. And so that is what this statement is doing. If they haven't worked over 40 hours, we're not concerned because they don't have any overtime. So that is a single-sided if. Then we also have an if-else. So with an if-else, you want it to do one action if it's true and another action if it's false. So it's pretty much set up the same way. You've got if, in parentheses, is the condition you're checking. You've got your curly braces, actions if it's true. Then you have else, curly braces, and all of the action statements you want executed if it is false. And if you only are executing one thing, like this example, you don't really have to have the curly braces, but I always put them in just kind of out of habit. That way, if I want to add more, they're there. So this example, if they've worked more than 40 hours, we're calculating the overtime, and if they haven't, we're just setting overtime to 0. So that would be the if-else. Nested if-else, the only time I ever use these is if I'm checking for multiple conditions, and those conditions are dependent on the previous result. So the way you set these up is you still have your if and your condition and your curly braces. You would still have an else, but right after the else, you have another if. So if it's true, you execute the actions and you're done. If it's false, you come down and check another condition. Okay, if that condition is true, you execute actions and you're done. Otherwise, if that one is false, you come down and you check another condition. And one of the better examples I have of this would be a score. So let's say you took a test, you got a score of 75. So if your score was 75, you get into this nested if-else, and we say if the score is greater than or equal to 90. Well, it's not. So then we come down here and we check to see if it's greater than or equal to 80. Now, we don't really need to check at this point to see if it's less than 90, because it wouldn't have gotten down there if it was greater than or equal to 90. Okay, if it's greater than or equal to 90, we print out the message and we're done. So the only way it gets down here is if it is less than 90. Okay, so we're checking now for greater than or equal to 80, and we know that it's already less than 90. Okay, and in this case, it's not true. So we go down to the next line. and we're asking, is it greater than or equal to 70? Okay, and it is. So then we echo their grade. Okay, so this example I like just because the scores are dependent on each other, okay, your conditions that you're checking. You're not going to get down here to check to see if it's greater than or equal to 70 unless it tested false and it's less than 90 and it's less than 80. That's the only way you're going to get down here. Okay, so this is a pretty good example of when to use an if-else, a nested one. Now we also have a switch, and I like to use switches when I'm testing for multiple conditions, and you usually test to see if something is equal to a variable. And it's just a really nice way to check for more than one condition. And so I'm getting a phone call, of course, right in the middle of this. Okay, so for a switch, you have your variable in here, and then you have your case. Case is a keyword, and the label can be a number, it can be a string. Probably easier if I show you the examples. So here we're checking favorite color. Okay, this happens to be a string. So the case that we're checking are all strings. And we're checking to see if the favorite color is equal to those different cases. Okay, and here we've got a number. And we're checking to see if the department is equal to 1, 2, or 3, 4 or 5, 6, 7, or 8. So this is kind of an equality test, and a switch lets you check for more than one thing. Okay, and it's a nice clean way of doing it. And another advantage to the switch is if the variable doesn't equal any of these, you can set up a default. Okay, so if it doesn't equal label 1, 2, 3, or n, whatever n is, you can have it go through code down in the default section. What you do need to remember about a switch is that you have to have a break in here. The reason you need the break is because once you come through here, and in this example, favorite color is red, once we have a match, a little flag goes on and it says, oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, so if you don't have the break, what happens is it kind of skips over the next test and just starts executing all of the statements. Okay, it'll come down here and execute this all the way down. Okay, that's why you have to have a break. What break does is it says, okay, get me out of this structure and I will execute the line below. Okay, so in this one, we have a 10. So it would come down here, flag goes on true. And so welcome to IT displays. We do have a break, so control goes below. And again, without the break, once that flag goes on to true, it would execute this too. So you have to remember to put in the break. It's not quite as important in default because default is the last thing that you would do. So once it's done with default, it's done. Okay, do you guys have any questions about selection? Okay, this should be similar to what you've seen before in other coding classes. Okay, it's just that we're dealing with PHP variables in this one. So repetition structures. These are basically loops. So if you have a section of code that you want to repeat, you want to put it in some type of a loop. And the loops that we use in PHP are pretty much the same as other languages. While, do while, for, and for each. I typically use for and for each for array processing. For each works really well with arrays, so we are going to wait to cover that until next week when we talk about arrays. Okay? We will talk about while, do while, and for today. While loop is set up kind of like this, where you've got the keyword while, and you have a condition, it's testing. As long as the condition is true, it basically goes through and executes all the code. Typically in a while loop, you have some type of a counter set up, and you're going to go through a specific number of times. So at the bottom of the loop, it's really important that you remember to increment the counter, because if you don't do that, you'll never get out of the loop. A couple of syntactical things you need to kind of be aware of is on the line with while, there is no semicolon, okay? We only have the semicolon on action statements. Okay, if you put a semicolon at the end of the line with the while, you have a do nothing loop. It doesn't do anything. It won't execute any of this code, okay? So here is a little example with the counter. This is very typical processing. We set the counter to 0. Sometimes people will set it to 1. You do that above the loop. Okay, then we're testing the counter to make sure it's less than 10. And this loop is not doing anything particularly special. It's just displaying what the counter is. And then we're increasing it by 1. Okay, so as we go through here, first time through, it's at 0. Then we come through again, it goes to 1, goes to 2. Okay, once it gets up to 10, this is going to test false, because 10 is not less than 10, it's equal to 10. So then we go to the line below the loop. The difference between a while loop and a do while loop is on a do while, you're not testing the condition until the end. So what that means is you are forcing them through the loop one time. In a while loop, it is possible for this to test false before you even get in the loop, okay? It's possible for that to happen. In a do while, they have to go through this one time, okay? Because the test isn't until the bottom. Otherwise, they're set up very similar. This one starts with do, you've got your braces. Action statements, we do increment a counter at the bottom. And the while that is testing the loop is after the curly brace. And then what's a little weird here is that you do put a semicolon at the end. That is a little bit different. On a regular while statement, you would never put a semicolon at the end of the condition, but in a do while you do. Okay, so that's something that you'll have to remember. And here's kind of that same counter example, but it's set up for a do while. So a for loop is kind of ideal for arrays, because when you put values into arrays, you can tell how long the array is. And with a for loop, there's actually 3 different values that you can have in the parentheses. The first value is typically used to initialize a counter. So you'd either set a counter to 1 or 0. So instead of initializing a counter above the loop, you do it right inside. Okay, and then you have a semicolon. After the first semicolon, that's where you have your condition. Then you have a second semicolon. After the second semicolon, this is where you would increment the counter. And you can actually have other equations in there as well, but at a minimal, if you're going to put something there, you do want to increase your counter there. Okay, so we have initialized the counter, you're setting it to 0 or 1. Here you're testing it to see if it's less than a value, and then you're incrementing. Okay, all in one line, so that in between your curly braces are the actions that you want to execute. You don't really have to worry about incrementing the counter that in there. Okay, so here is that same example that we looked at before, where we're setting the counter to 0, checking it less than 10, adding 1 to it, and we're printing it out. You guys have any questions? Nope. Okay. So continue and break statements. You guys saw the break in the switch structure. It's really critical that you remember to put it into that structure. You can use it in loops as well. What it'll do if you're in a loop is it will drop control to the line below the loop. So it actually takes you completely out of the loop. Okay. Usually if I've set up a game and the game is in a loop, it's like a guessing game or something like that, and I ask them if they want to continue playing. As long as they say yes, I stay in the loop. If they answer no, then I might have an if statement checking the value that they answered, and I can break out of the loop at that point. Okay, there's other conditions you can check as well, but that would be an example of when you would use a break. Continue, what that lets you do when you're in a loop is you can check a condition, and then if it tests true, you can continue execution at the top of the loop. So if you're like halfway through, you can skip the code that's at the bottom and go back up to the top. Okay, and so here I have a little example. So I've got a counter, and it looks like I've set it to -4. And you'll notice that I didn't put it inside 4, but I still had to have the semicolon. The only thing that's really required in a for loop is the condition. Okay, but you still have to put those semicolons in. So here I set the counter to -4. We're going to stay in the loop while it's less than or equal to 10, and I'm going to increase it by 1 each time. So here, if the counter is equal to 0, I'm going to continue, which means I go back up here and increase 1. So I'm basically skipping that value. Okay, and part of the reason I'm skipping the value is I'm doing division. And you cannot divide by 0. Okay, so here I've got a temporary variable that's going to store the result of that division, and then I'm echoing out what the counter is and what the result is. Okay, and because I can't divide by 0, I want to skip that one. And having that little if check in there with the continue will allow me to skip it. Okay, you guys have any questions? Yes, no? Okay. Looping errors. So when we're looping, forgetting to increment the counter is a problem. Usually beginners run into this. If you don't increase the counter by 1, your condition will never test false, and you will be in the loop forever. It's called an infinite loop. Usually it's kind of, people who are first coding usually have this happen once. Their screen flashes at them and it's pretty exciting. So after it happens once or twice, you kind of get wise and you don't forget to increment your counter anymore. But you know, all you have to do in this case would be close out your browser and you're fine. So, but that is a typical error. Another error is off by 1. So how this off by 1 error occurs is typically you're going to set a counter to 0 or 1. If you set it to 0, then let's say you want to go through 10 times. You want to check to make sure it's less than 10. You don't want to do less than or equal to 10. Because if you start at 0 and you do less than or equal to 10, okay, it's going to go through 4 times 0. Then it's going to go through 1 through 10. When it hits 10, 10 is still less than or equal to 0. So it's going to go through, and you're going to have 11 times. Okay? So if you start at 0, basically you need to use less than. And if you start at 1, you'd want to use less than or equal to. Okay? So if I set the counter at 1 and I just say less than 10, okay, it's only going to go through 9 times. It's going to go through 1 through 9, and then when it flips up to 10, well, 10 is not less than 10. 10 is equal to 10. Okay? So it would only go through the 9 times. So depending on how you initialize your counter, that's going to affect whether you use less than or less than and equal to. Okay? So what I usually recommend is that you just get in the habit of initializing to 0 or initializing to 1. I usually initialize to 0 because arrays, you start subscripting in with a 0, okay? And so for me, that's just a good habit to use. So I usually initialize at 0, and I always use less than. Okay, then I don't run into this off by 1 error. Does that make sense? Yes, no, yeah, okay. Okay. I already mentioned putting a semicolon at the end of the for or while statement. That's a very, very common error. So basically, if you do something like this, you have a do nothing loop because it doesn't execute any of your statements. Another very common error is if you wanted it to do more than one thing, you forget to put the curly braces around it. So if you don't use curly braces, by default, it only is going to execute the line below. So without curly braces, it would just do the very first command over and over and over again. Okay, so that's another really common error. You guys have any questions about selection or repetition? No, okay. User-defined functions. So PHP lets you create your own functions, and it comes with more than 1,000 functions that are built in. So we are going to focus more on user-defined functions. And basically, if you've written code and you've noticed that you've used the same code over and over in different areas of your program, that's kind of an indication that you should pull that code out and put it into a function. Okay? Then you have it in one place, and you can call it from those multiple places in your program. Okay? A function can only be executed by calling it. And in PHP, the function name itself is not case sensitive, but you have to start it with either a letter or an underscore. I pretty much always start mine with letters, okay? But you know, if you're an underscore person, you can start it like that. You can create a function with 0 parameters. So what that means is we use the keyword function, we give it some kind of name, and then we do have to have the parentheses, but there's nothing in those parentheses, okay? So that is no parameters. We're not sending it any data, okay? And then we've got an opening curly and a closing curly, and then in between we've got all of the action statements that we're going to execute. So here is, you guys can tell I'm always hungry when I make these up, so here is my little function here. I am defining a constant called chocolate. And then this is true, Toblerone is my favorite type of chocolate, it's Swiss. And so that is something that I've defined. And then I've got a function called yum. And you can see I am printing out chocolate and doing it again here. So here is where I'm calling yum. Okay, I'm not passing it anything. So it just comes up here. It's printing out the constant. And the constant is not case sensitive because I put true here. Okay, so it's printing out this phrase, Toblerone is my favorite chocolate, printing out a line break, and then it's printing that out again. Okay, and then it's done. Okay, so when I feel like exclaiming that Toblerone is my favorite chocolate, all I have to do is call yum, and there it goes, it prints it off. So that is no parameters. And you can also create functions that have parameters. So what that means is you are passing it data. So here we got the same chocolate constant defined. And here we have a function. The name of the function is yum. And we do have a parameter. Okay? And when we're inside the function, we've given the variable a name, favorite. So in the parentheses, whatever you call the data that's coming in, okay, you're actually kind of defining the variable there. So within the function, anytime I want to access this value that's coming in, I'm going to use $favorite because that's what I'm calling it. So if I want to print it, I would print $favorite. If it was a number and I wanted to add it, I would use $favorite plus 10 or whatever. Okay? So anytime I want to refer to that when I'm in the function, this is the name that I've given it. Okay? Does that make sense? So down here I've got my function calls and I'm passing it that constant chocolate. That's what's coming in. So this is what gets printed out. Okay? And I made the constant so that the case does not matter. It is case insensitive. So it doesn't matter how I type chocolate. I mean, I could do a lowercase c and all uppercase letters for the rest, and it would still work. Okay? So that is a function with parameters and arguments. You can set this up for multiple arguments. So here I have a function called student, and I'm going to be passing it 3 arguments, the name, the major, and the GPA. And then I'm basically going to print out the name, a little phrase about the major, and some information about the GPA. Here is where I'm calling it, and you can see I'm passing it the data. So when I'm in the function, name is referring to Scooby-Doo, major is referring to forensics, and GPA is referring to 1.5. Then when I call it again, this is the data I'm passing. And so Thelma, whenever I want to refer to name, the value that's stored is Thelma. When I'm referring to major, the value is law enforcement, and when I refer to GPA, it is 4.0. Okay, so when you're passing the data, it is positional, and the variable names that you use in your argument list are the ones that you have to use when you're in the function. Does that make sense? Okay. And then a lot of times, just to clarify, and this is confusing because you'll see the word parameter and argument used interchangeably, and they're kind of referring to the same thing. But when you're defining a function and you're saying what you're going to call the data that's coming in, technically those are parameters. And when you are calling the function, so when I have the function name here and I'm actually sending it data, the data that I'm sending is technically an argument. Okay, now these terms are used interchangeably, so argument and parameter are kind of the same thing. Okay, it's basically the If for an argument, it's the data you're passing. Parameter is the data you're bringing in. So we talked about how to create the function with no arguments, how to create it with one or multiple arguments. We're going to take a quick look at how to set up default values. So what happens if someone calls the function and they don't give you all the values that you're expecting? If you set up default values, it'll use those default values. So to set up a default in your parameters, all you have to do is set the parameter equal to a value, and then that becomes the default value. So if they do pass you something, it doesn't use the default. But if they don't pass you something, then you have a value you can use. So in this little example, I have a function called pay rate, and I have name, which doesn't have a default value. I have hours, which I've set to 40, and I have rate, which I've set to 13. So if they call pay rate and all they do is provide a name, the hours will be 40, the rate will be 13. Okay, so that when we come through here, it'll be able to print out everything, and it'll also be able to do the total pay calculation. Because without a value for hours and rate, that would kind of bomb. Okay, so down here, we're calling pay rate and I'm passing Scooby-Doo. So that's coming through as name. I do not have hours and rate specified, so it's going to use 40 and 13. And then it'll process the function. For Thelma, I did specify values. So when we come up here, instead of having 40 hours, Thelma is going to have 30. And instead of having a rate of 13, Thelma is going to have a rate of 20. Okay, so it'll be using 30 and 20 when it goes through here and calculates Thelma. Does that make sense? And again, the reason that you provide those defaults is so that the person using the code or the program, they don't know the values, they don't have to enter them. So the last thing we're going to talk about regarding functions is the functions that actually return values. So far, the ones we looked at, they're kind of self-contained and they're not returning anything. A lot of functions will do processing and then they will return a value. So they might be bringing in values that get passed to them, they do some kind of calculation, and they return the result. So this little example has a function called sum. We're going to bring in two values, and then we add them together, store them in Z, and then we return Z. So it is returning a value. So when that happens, you typically will have an assignment statement when you call the function, or you might have something like this, where the function call is part of a print statement. Okay, and that's what this is doing. So it's going to print out 5 plus 10 equals. Then we're calling the function and we're sending it 5 and 10. So it's going to zip through here. 5 plus 10 is 15. It returns the value 15 to this location, and the number 15 will print out. Okay, we get a line break. On the next line, it's got 7 plus 13. Here we're calling the function. We're sending it the 7 and 13. It adds them together, calculates 20, returns the number 20 to this location. So it prints out the number 20. Okay, and basically does the same thing for 2 and 4. So one technique, if you're returning a value, is to just have it printed right away. We're not storing it. The other technique, when it returns a value, is to actually store the value. So this little example is similar to the one we looked at before. We've got pay rate We're bringing in name, hours, and rate, but you'll notice that instead of printing out the total pay, we're returning it. Okay, so it's got weekly pay for, prints out the name, calculates the total pay, showing the hours and the rate. But instead of printing the total pay, it's returning it. So here's where we're calling it. Okay, we're only sending it the name, so it's going to use 40 and 13, calculates up the total pay, returns it to where it's called from, and we have an assignment statement. So that total pay is going to get stored over here. Okay, and then on the next line, we're printing that out. And it'll do the same thing for the next one. Here's the call. Okay, so it comes up here, prints out the data, calculates up total pay, and returns the total pay, which is stored right here. And then we print it out. Now, you guys have any questions on functions? Yay or nay? Turn on your mic. Okay.
So is that kind of like a local variable then? Or are the arguments used kind of like local variables?
Yes, because when we bring them in like this, they're only really known inside this function. So
okay.
That's the scope they would have.
Okay.
Yep. And like pay is known outside of the function. So this variable we wouldn't be able to access from inside the function.
Gotcha.
It's only known outside. Okay.
Okay.
Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, how PHP does this is very similar to other languages. So it's just a matter of remembering the PHP syntax.